Mao believed he could turn China into a great world power. He was initially constrained by the need to rebuild following a very destructive civil war, so some private ownership was allowed at this time. The first 5-year plan in the 50s began the process of central planning, but this model was abandoned for the Great Leap Forward. The Great Leap Forward proved a disastrous mistake, with some peasant resentment building up. The economy was gradually revived, but then the Cultural Revolution of 1966 hit. Some equality was granted to women in practice, and there was a successful drive to raise literacy rates. Young people were indoctrinated through youth organizations and played a major part in the Cultural Revolution. The communists tried to weaken the power of organized religion. However, the success was limited. Culture did suffer as it became a branch of Maoist propaganda. So Mao's economic policies were fluid over time. One of his basic beliefs was collective ownership of the means of production, like the naturalization of industry and also collective farming. He also had a desire to make China a great world power, equal or even surpass the Soviet Union's economic achievement. He also wanted to avoid dependency on an outside power, which was really smart. He also had the immediate need for recovery after the damage caused by the Civil War. Mao knew that to achieve these ends, China would need to increase its capital for industrial investment. He planned to do this by reducing foreign imports and boosting the export market in Chinese agricultural goods. He never trusted scientific experts. He actually attacked intellectuals, and he believed that manpower alone could make his plans a success. Through sheer hard work, he believed that China could become self-sufficient. This was the focus of the Great Leap Forward of 1958. So this is one of those issues still debated by historians on how many of the sheer amounts died. But what happened was this, is Mao starts encouraging non-landowner peasants to attack the landowners. So this was the way of really moving from that cooperative time period where some capitalism was allowed to then attacking. It becomes a very public thing. Up to 2 million were probably killed, although Mao claimed it was only 800,000. Historians certainly know that there was a policy to select at least one landlord from each village and then publicly have them executed. So all this land was then collected and a cooperative kind of farming was created. The official policy was never entirely consistent. At first, Mao condemned that it went too fast, and then he said later that it wasn't going fast enough. So this was a very confusing time. By 1955, there was a big push to get everybody to help each other and form more communes, but by the end of 1956, most villages had formed collectives, and by 1957, over 90% of peasant families were incorporated into some type of commune. The state had become the sole purchaser of grain by 1953, and peasants were obliged to sell fixed quotas to the state. This gave the CCP greater control of the countryside than any previous regime. John King Fairbank referred to this as modern serfdom under party control. The idea about the Great Leap Forward came after Mao toured the countryside and thought, you know what, we need larger communes. And so he divided China into a series of communes, each divided by population. Each one would have to control their own irrigation, have flood control, create electricity. There was to be some factories so that women and children could go to work. And also for men, nobody was to be unemployed at all. There also followed a series of Mao-endorsed campaigns to get rid of mosquitoes and rats. However, communal farming failed to work. By tradition, most peasants in China were subsistent farmers. They didn't really have an idea of these large global kind of farming, and officials trying to lead them had very little knowledge of farming either. Some peasants became too involved in the industrial enterprises, and as a result, they neglected agriculture. Others, influenced by propaganda, just left the fields and, went into industrialization. This again is going to create a famine. So what little industry China had already been taken under the control of the GMD before 1949. So this moderate period of national capitalism between 1949 and 1953 had minimal disruption. During this period, the state took over the ownership of heavy industry and the banking system only. Wages and prices were regulated, but members of the national bourgeoisie were still able to make profits. In 1953, 20% of heavy industry and 60% of light industry was still privately owned. During this period, China turned to the Soviet Union for support. The Soviets signed a Treaty of Friendship in 1950 and provided 300 million in Russian loans to be repayable largely through food exports, which is going to hurt them later. During the 1950s, 11,000 Soviet experts arrived in China, while 28,000 Chinese received training in the Soviet Union. Between 1949 and 1952, the value of industrial output more than doubled, and 300 modern industrial plants were planned, including factories for iron, steel, motor vehicles, and aircraft. The period of national capitalism ended with the launch of the first five-year plan in 1953. It was intended to speed up China's industrial growth. Over the next 2 years, all private industries and businesses were nationalized, although many former owners were still kept on as managers and given an annual share of the profits. This did lead to a period of intense production. Sectors such as iron and steel and energy and transport were prioritized over the expensive consumer industries. A lot of factories were planned in many different areas, although it's really hard to say how successful China was. These figures cannot be necessarily trusted, but we do know for the first time China came to produce its own cars, tractors, airplanes, cargo ships, machine tools, and penicillin. The urban population also grew from 57 million to 100 million by 1957. So the Great Leap Forward is probably one of Mao's most controversial policies, that with the Cultural Revolution. He first indicated that he wanted to do this in a speech in 1956 on the 10 Great Relationships, where he indicated that rather than go with the Soviet method of industrialization, he wanted to combine both agriculture and industry. He called this idea for China to walk on two legs and develop both for several reasons. First of all, the rise in agricultural productivity had been in decline, and so he wanted to highlight that. He also wanted to highlight the difference between skilled and unskilled workers. He was worried that the CCP was becoming too bureaucratic and wanted to reduce the influence of central planning in the Soviets. This leap involved improvements in agriculture and infrastructure and industrial growth. In urban areas, the cadres were expected to increase output beyond levels previously even considered. Party branches took over the direction of factories in order to put politics in command. Even children had to work. State-owned enterprise became, completely owned by the state. There were fixed rates of pay, conditions, targets, all of this incurred. And there was the same drive in the agricultural regions. Peasants were told that they would get rich quicker if they could just produce more, faster, Better. 3 years of bitter struggle, 10,000 years of joy. In 1958, the drive to produce metals locally led to around 9 million peasants becoming involved in steel production. Small-scale backyard industrial projects began on farm units, and peasants abandoned other work to build brick furnaces in their yards. So you can just imagine, I mean, even children were riding their bikes, collecting the ore and delivering it. Every person in a commune was directed to do this. Around 600,000 furnaces are going to be working in the rural areas. So you can imagine what they're not doing, right? They're so focused on this new idea, they're not growing the food that's going to be needed. Here's another question that is debated between historians. I mean, undoubtedly, there was economic growth in China after 1949 and during the Great Leap Forward. Rural industrialization spread and China's infrastructure was developed. However, in most respects, the Great Leap Forward and its aftermath was little less than disastrous. The leader of the Soviet Union at the time warned Mao that it was a dangerous experiment. However, Mao refused to back down, and this just led to a rift between the Soviets and China. In towns, political interference made it difficult to operate a national plan, and in the countryside, the results were even worse. In 1959, the government took 28% of the peasants' grain, as opposed to 17% in 1957, and the price paid was kept low in both 1959 and 1960. Some over-enthusiastic peasants almost abandoned farming altogether in order to meet the drive to work the furnaces. And things just got worse. Government policy and the worst drought for a century in northern and central China in 1960, plus flooding in the south, produced a really dangerous, horrible famine. The years between 1959 and 1961 became known as the Three Bitter Years, when between 20 to 50 million people died. However, Mao's government refused to acknowledge what was happening. By 1962, Deng Xiaoping steps in and tries to undo some of the damage. It took at least 5 years just to recover from the damage to agriculture. The revival of industry was faster, aided by the discovery of huge oil and gas fields by 1965. However, factories continued to be run inefficiently. So in the end, overall production declined in the 1960s. Although Mao's Cultural Revolution from 1966 did not officially change economic policies, the chaos it produced affected economic growth. The re-questioning of China, oh my God, they took trains, okay? They took trains and trucks to carry the red guards around the countryside to scare everybody. And this is going to slow factory production too. So in the end, it's really only going to be after 1976, the year Mao died, and really they have to get rid of his supporters, the Gang of Four. After that, in October 1976, China really did begin to develop its potential as an economic powerhouse. So traditionally in China, women had no equality. They were to obey men, whether it's their father or their husband. You had practices of concubines where men could have multiple women, foot binding, arranged marriages, all of this. You know, Mao came out against arranged marriages early on. He actually famously once proclaimed, "Women hold up half the sky," and the CCP had always advocated female equality. Many women served as soldiers. From 1950, the traditional practice of killing unwanted baby girls was officially abolished, although not always enforced. Foot binding was outlawed, and girls were expected to go to school and women to work. The 1950 marriage law forbade arranged marriages and child betrothals, the payment of dowries, and concubinage. Official registration of marriage was introduced, and new laws made divorce allowable by mutual consent or on the complaint of either husband or wife. Those who had been subject to arranged marriages were allowed to petition for divorce. The 1953 election law gave women the right to vote, and some joined the government and the PLA. Women were actively encouraged to train for jobs formerly held only by men. There was a drive to curb prostitution. In the 1950s, laws gave women the same property rights as men. Some were even granted land in their own name. In the communes, communal eating and shared cleaning released women from traditional household chores. And here and in the larger factories in towns, communal nurseries and kindergartens allowed them to escape child mating, escape raising children, and return to work. However, communist policy towards women did not always bring positive results. There was a huge increase in the numbers of divorce. 1.3 million divorce petitions were filed in 1953 alone by wives who were treated illy or, just because they were wanted to. It was pretty cool, huh? Although the number of women in work increased from 8% to 32%, jobs could be physically demanding, and many women had to act as both workers and mothers. In the rural and Muslim areas, government interference was resented and arranged marriages continued. Women provided only 13% of the party membership and 14 to 23% of the deputies in the National People's Congress. Communes and schools where children were taught to love Mao was more important than love for their family, which did undermine the family unit. Initially, the communists favored large families that swelled the population in the early 1950s. However, the coming of the famine, women were told that 2 children were the ideal. Late marriage at 25 to 27 years for men and 23 years for women was encouraged, and couples who had large families or did not allow sufficient time between pregnancies were criticized in their group meetings. Partly because of this campaign, the Chinese population grew more slowly than had been expected, although between 1953 and 1964 it increased by 112 million. So in 1959, only about 1 in Chinese people could read, and many could not write because there was no standardized form of written Mandarin. Only 20% of children went to primary school and around 1% to secondary, and the number of female students beyond primary level just was not even, you couldn't even measure it. So the CCP became determined to increase literacy rates. First, they set up schools for all children. Okay, and study groups and night schools were set up. With little teacher scheme was established. Cuba's going to do the same thing, by the way, where children visited adult peasants and then taught them what they learned. Castro's actually going to cancel. He's going to start a bunch of schools and then cancel school and send all the kids home to teach their parents to read. So anyways, Mao is going to set that standard. Chinese characters were simplified for quick learning. Pinyin was approved by the National People's Congress in 1964, and it simplified Chinese characters. Secondary schooling expanded, helped initially by teachers from the Soviet Union, and also scholarships were provided to other universities, especially, again, the Soviets. However, this stopped in the 1960s. And so China starts to build their own education system. Key schools were given priority and teachers were revered. Mao was a teacher. And so the results appeared pretty impressive. By 1957, most village children had some type of education. However, there were a number of factors that limited the degree of educational advance. First of all, education was neither compulsory nor free and was never a budget priority. Shocking, right? And then the quality of education varied. Again, same with our system. The emphasis on practical education and also propaganda was more important than actual learning. And so you see this today, whereas the education system in China is based mostly on memorization versus critical thinking. They really do not want that. to happen. And so schools really are the center of indoctrination, encouraging a cult of the leader. During the Cultural Revolution, most schools and universities were closed down, by the way. The official communist view was that religion was a capitalist invention used to keep the lower classes in their place with promises of a better afterlife. Mao was really hostile towards organized religion, referring to it as poison. Confucianism, Buddhism, Islam, and Christianity alike were condemned as superstitious, and Maoist China saw the closure of churches, temples, shrines, and monasteries. Foreign priests and missionaries were expelled, and Chinese ones forbidden to wear distinctive dress. Religious toleration was officially guaranteed by the Chinese Constitution, but the government had its own definition of religion, and a campaign against superstition began in 1950. Ancestor worship was condemned, and traditional religious rituals banned. However, religious establishments could become patriotic churches operating under government control, provided they did not endanger the security of the state and broke all links to overseas churches. Clergy had to profess support for the communist regime and allow the government to vet appointments. Some Buddhist temples, Muslim mosques, and less often Christian churches were given state money. During the Cultural Revolution of 1966, churches were attacked in general. Religion was denounced as belonging to one of the four olds. Temples, churches, religious images, and shrines were destroyed, any that were left. Even an ancient Buddha statue in the Summer Palace in Beijing was destroyed. So as a result, this is going to become attack and even further. Anything really past culture wise is going to be attacked. This is going to set China back a long ways. Um, as for Tibet, this is still a very controversial issue. Tibet was captured and renamed in 1950. The outlawing of the Lama faith, a form of Buddhism, and Tibetan culture provoked a national uprising in 1959, which was brutally crushed. Even speaking of the Dalai Lama, who was the leader of the Buddhist faith, he had to flee and lives in northern India today, was an arrestable offense. The communists imposed extreme policies. Tibetans were forced to grow wheat and corn, even though they proved indigestible for them. And herders were made to farm high ground and not allow their yaks to roam. This severely cut supplies of milk, cheese, meat, and yak hair, which was used for clothes and tents. The ensuing famine caused the deaths of a quarter of the Tibetan population. The Panchen Lama, second to the Dalai Lama, sent Mao a letter detailing the suffering and accusing Mao of genocide. Mao rejected this as a lie. There was, however, a limit to how much Mao could reshape private belief. In the more remote areas, it remained strong, and in Tibet, the Lama faith inspired continued resistance to Chinese occupation. Mao associated China's rich traditional culture with feudal and imperial society and believed it needed to be swept away and replaced by a communist culture which exalted the common man. Writers and artists were expected to educate the masses, not create artistic works for their own sake. In the 1950s, traditional Chinese art was still allowed and continued alongside more modern Soviet-inspired art that was really just propaganda. Old style poetry also continued, although younger poets were encouraged to write about new agricultural and industrial achievements. Plays and films were overtly propaganda, and everything was controlled by the state. Newspapers, journals, everything, all news media was centralized and controlled by the PRC. Although the Hundred Flowers campaign did bring forth a burst of freedom, the repression that followed kind of killed that. All art really had to glorify the communist struggle and really could not look back. Rigid censorship forbade all works with any relevant contemporary Chinese themes. The sale or possession of foreign literature was banned. And actually, the only book you could readily buy was Mao's Little Red Book. Artists of all sorts were terrorized into silence and made to submit to struggle sessions. By the early 1970s, China was an artistic wasteland. Old culture had been destroyed by nothing of value, had risen to take its place. So the big question is, to what extent did Mao succeed? Is our idea of Mao colored by our own perceptions? And honestly, did he lead to the modernization of China? I think a better question, though, is how different was Mao than traditional leaders? To what extent did China even change during the communist period? Today, they did achieve what Mao hoped for: superpower, competitive against the British and the United States. Japan is just a shadow to China today. So he did achieve these things, but to what extent did that cost the average Chinese person everything?